The radio crackled to life in the conning tower of USS Silversides at 03:15 hours on the morning of December 12, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Creed Burlingame stood hunched over the navigation table, studying convoy intercept plots by the dim red glow of battle lighting. They'd been tracking a Japanese convoy for 6 hours, a fat collection of cargo vessels steaming south from Truk toward Rabaul, and now they were finally in position. Burlingame had 24 torpedoes loaded aboard his boat. 10 Mark 14s in the forward torpedo room, 4 in the aft tubes, and 10 reloads ready to go. The Japanese convoy had no idea what was about to hit them. Not because Silversides was invisible, or because American submarines were particularly stealthy in late 1942, but because the Gato-class submarine represented a weapons platform the Imperial Japanese Navy had fundamentally misunderstood. The Japanese assumed American submarines would attack the way their own boats did, fire 1 or 2 torpedoes at a target, maybe 3 if you were feeling aggressive, then dive deep and run. Conservative shooting that preserved torpedoes for multiple attacks. They were wrong, catastrophically, brutally wrong. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Gato-class submarine was 311 feet of American industrial ambition, launched into the Pacific at a rate that would have seemed impossible to pre-war planners. Mare Island Naval Shipyard, Electric Boat Company in Groton, Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, and Manitowoc Shipbuilding in Wisconsin were pumping out these boats like automobiles rolling off Ford's assembly line. Between 1941 and 1943, American shipyards would deliver 77 Gato-class boats, each one carrying more torpedoes than any submarine in history. The specification told part of the story. Displacement of 1,525 tons surfaced, 1,910 tons submerged. 4 diesel engines generating 5,400 horsepower, giving the boat a surface speed of 20.25 knots. 2 126-cell batteries, providing submerged propulsion for extended periods. A diving depth rated officially at 300 feet, though most commanders would push them deeper when desperate. Range of 11,000 nautical miles at 10 knots, which meant they could patrol from Pearl Harbor to the Japanese home islands and back without refueling. But the real story was in the torpedo rooms. The forward torpedo room held 6 tubes arranged in 2 rows of 3, with 4 reload torpedoes stored beneath the deck plates and 6 more in overhead racks. The after torpedo room contained 4 tubes with 4 reloads, 24 fish total, each one a Mark 14 torpedo weighing 3,200 pounds, carrying a 143-pound Torpex warhead, capable of running at 46 knots for 4,500 yards. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Their most common submarine, the Type B, carried 17 torpedoes. The German Type 7 U-boat that was devastating Allied shipping in the Atlantic carried 14. American submarine designers had looked at the vast distances of the Pacific, calculated engagement scenarios, and decided that more torpedoes meant more flexibility, more killing power, more ability to stay on station and continue attacking after initial contact. They were building submarines designed to sink entire convoys in single engagements, not to nibble at the edges and run away. The doctrine emerged from bitter experience in the first year of the war. When the United States entered the conflict in December 1941, the submarine force operated under peacetime thinking. Attack doctrine called for single torpedo shots at individual targets from maximum range, prioritizing submarine survival over aggressive engagement. Commanders who pressed close attacks were seen as reckless. The result was predictably disappointing. American submarines would shadow Japanese convoys for hours, fire 2 or 3 torpedoes from 5,000 yards, watch them miss or fail to detonate, then slink away to file reports about mechanical failures and missed opportunities. By mid-1942, the submarine force was frustrated and humiliated. They had the boats, they had the targets, but they weren't sinking enough ships to matter. The change came from commanders who decided to ignore doctrine and fight their boats the way the boats were designed to be fought. Men like Dudley Mush Morton on USS Wahoo, who proved that aggressive surface attacks at night could devastate convoys before escorts even knew a submarine was present. Men like Sam Dealey on USS Harder, who would eventually develop tactics for sinking destroyers with bowshots that required closing to less than 1,000 yards. And men like Creed Burlingame, standing in Silverside's conning tower on that December night, about to demonstrate what a Gato-class boat could do when its commander stopped thinking conservatively and started thinking industrially. The tactic that would revolutionize American submarine warfare had a deceptively simple name: the spread. Instead of firing one torpedo at a time and hoping for a hit, you fired multiple torpedoes simultaneously, each one aimed at slightly different angles to cover the target's possible movements. If the target turned left, one torpedo would hit. If it turned right, a different torpedo would hit. If it maintained course, multiple torpedoes might strike. The spread turned torpedo attacks from precision shooting into area denial, forcing the target into a killing zone where evasion became impossible. But executing a spread attack required calculation, confidence, and nerve that most submarine commanders in 1942 simply didn't possess. You had to get close, within 2,000 yards ideally, because longer ranges gave torpedoes more time to malfunction and gave targets more time to maneuver. You had to fire multiple torpedoes in rapid succession, which meant committing significant ordnance to a single attack. Miss with a 6-torpedo spread, and you just expended a quarter of your combat load on nothing. And you had to stay at periscope depth or on the surface during the attack, exposed and vulnerable, while escorts charged toward you and your own torpedoes were still running toward their targets. The Japanese never expected it because their own submarine doctrine emphasized preservation of the submarine over destruction of targets. Japanese submarine commanders were taught to fire 1 or 2 torpedoes, then immediately dive to evasion depth and break contact. The idea of staying exposed to fire 6 or 8 or 10 torpedoes in a single attack seemed insanely reckless to them. They didn't understand that American submarines were built with enough torpedo capacity to make such attacks sustainable, and American industrial production could replace expended torpedoes faster than Japanese shipyards could replace sunken vessels. Burlingame brought Silversides to the surface at 0330 hours, 11,000 yards from the convoy. He could see them on the horizon, a cluster of dark shapes silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky. 7 cargo vessels in 2 columns, escorted by what looked like 3 destroyers prowling the flanks. The convoy was making about 9 knots, zigzagging on a base course of 175 degrees. Burlingame ordered all the front flank and began the approach. Silversides cut through the calm Pacific swells at 19 knots, spray cascading over the bridge as she closed the distance. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Get ahead of the convoy, position Silversides perpendicular to their course, then fire a full bow salvo, 6 torpedoes at the 3 largest targets in the formation. Reload the forward tubes as fast as possible and fire again. Then swing the stern around and empty the after tubes at anything still floating. Maximum aggression, maximum ordnance expenditure, maximum destruction in minimum time. At 4,000 yards, the Japanese still hadn't spotted them. Silversides' low profile, just the conning tower and a sliver of deck above the water, was nearly invisible in the darkness. At 3,000 yards, Burlingame ordered the approach to slow. They needed to maintain position relative to the convoy, not overshoot. The fire control computer, a mechanical analog device called the torpedo data computer, was continuously fed information by the executive officer. Target bearing, range, angle on the bow, speed. The TDC calculated the proper gyro angles for each torpedo to hit its intended target, accounting for the torpedo's runtime and the target's movement during that time. At 2,000 yards, Burlingame gave the order to fire. The first torpedo left Tube 1 at 0402 hours. 3 seconds later, Tube 2 fired. Then 3, 4, 5, 6 in precise sequence, each torpedo aimed at a slightly different point in the convoy formation. The Mark 14s ran hot, straight, and normal, leaving phosphorescent wakes that streaked toward the enemy. Burlingame watched through binoculars, counting seconds until impact. 45, 50, 55. At 63 seconds, the first explosion lit up the night. A cargo vessel amidships erupted in flames as 643 pounds of torpex detonated against her hull. Before the sound reached Silversides, 2 more explosions followed in rapid succession. Different ships, different impacts, both catastrophic. The Japanese escorts finally realized they were under attack, but they had no idea where the submarine was or how many torpedoes were still in the water. Burlingame had already ordered the boat hard to starboard, presenting the stern tubes toward the convoy, while the forward torpedo room crew worked frantically to reload. The reload process on a Gato-class boat was a masterpiece of choreographed chaos. Each torpedo weighed over 1.5 tons. Moving them from storage racks to tubes required hydraulic hoists, careful balancing, and a crew that had drilled the procedure until they could do it in their sleep. The record reload time for a Gato-class forward torpedo room was 7 minutes and 20 seconds. Silversides' crew was aiming for under 8 minutes, while their boat maneuvered at flank speed on the surface with Japanese destroyers charging toward them. At 0406 hours, Burlingame fired the 4 stern torpedoes at the remaining ships in the convoy. He wasn't being selective now. Any target was a good target. The stern spread caught a tanker and another cargo vessel. The tanker's refined petroleum cargo ignited instantly, creating a pillar of fire visible 20 miles. The convoy was disintegrating. Ships were turning in random directions, trying to escape. Escorts were dropping depth charges at phantom contacts, having no idea that Silversides was still on the surface, racing parallel to the convoy at 17 knots. At 0413 hours, the forward tubes were reloaded. Burlingame swung the bow back toward what remained of the convoy and fired another 6 torpedo spread. This time he was shooting at targets silhouetted against the burning tanker, which made range estimation easier but also made Silversides more visible. One of the Japanese destroyers finally spotted them and turned to engage, but Burlingame had already factored that into his calculations. The last 2 torpedoes in the spread were aimed not at cargo vessels, but at the destroyer itself. Shooting at destroyers with torpedoes was generally considered a waste of ordnance. Destroyers were small, fast, maneuverable targets that could often evade torpedo attacks. But, if you fired from close enough range with proper lead calculations, even destroyers couldn't dodge. The destroyer took 1 torpedo in the forward magazine and 1 just aft of the bridge. She broke in half and sank in less than 2 minutes. 14 torpedoes expended in 11 minutes, 5 confirmed hits, possibly 6. 3 cargo vessels sinking or already sunk, 1 tanker burning, 1 destroyer destroyed, and Silverside still had 10 torpedoes remaining. Burlingame ordered a crash dive and took the boat deep as the remaining escorts converged on their last known position. But by the time depth charges started falling, Silversides was already a half-mile away, creeping south at 3 knots, silent and invisible. The Japanese convoy that limped into Rabaul 30 hours later reported being attacked by at least 3 American submarines operating in coordination. They couldn't conceive that a single submarine had fired that many torpedoes in such a short time. It didn't fit their understanding of how submarine warfare worked. The attack reports reached Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's headquarters within 48 hours, and Japanese naval intelligence began trying to understand what had happened. They knew American submarines carried more torpedoes than Japanese boats, but they'd assumed American commanders would use them the same way Japanese commanders did. Carefully, conservatively, 1 or 2 at a time. The idea that American doctrine now emphasized mass torpedo salvos, expending half a submarine's ordnance in a single attack, seemed wasteful and reckless. They were correct that it was aggressive. They were catastrophically wrong that it was wasteful. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The mathematics of torpedo warfare favored the Americans in ways the Japanese never fully appreciated. A Gato-class submarine cost approximately $2 million to build in 1942. A Mark 14 torpedo cost $10,000. If a submarine fired 12 torpedoes at a convoy and sank 3 cargo vessels worth $2 million each in ships and cargo, the attack generated a 600-to-1 return on ammunition expenditure alone. Even if only 2 ships sank, the economics still heavily favored aggressive torpedo use. The Japanese were operating under a fundamentally different economic calculation. They had fewer submarines, couldn't replace them quickly, and couldn't manufacture torpedoes at anywhere near American production rates. Japanese submarine doctrine therefore emphasized conservation, maximizing the number of patrols a submarine could conduct before returning to base for resupply. This made perfect sense given their industrial limitations, but it meant Japanese submarines remained peripheral players in the Pacific War, occasionally sinking valuable targets but never achieving the systematic campaign of destruction that American submarines would inflict. American industrial production was reaching levels in 1942 that would have seemed like fantasy just 5 years earlier. The Naval Torpedo Station at Newport, Rhode Island, and the Naval Ordnance Plant at Forest Park, Illinois, were producing Mark 14 torpedoes at a combined rate of over 100 per week by mid-1942. That rate would increase to nearly 200 per week by 1943. American submarines could fire torpedoes knowing that resupply was never more than 1 patrol away. This industrial advantage translated directly into tactical flexibility. A commander who knew he could reload at Pearl Harbor or Midway in 2 weeks felt free to expend torpedoes liberally. A commander who knew resupply meant a 3-month transit back to Japan conserved every fish like it was irreplaceable. The torpedo itself was evolving rapidly under combat conditions. The Mark 14 that Burlingame fired in December 1942 was a problematic weapon, plagued by depth control failures, magnetic exploder malfunctions, and contact exploder defects that caused torpedoes to bounce off target hulls without detonating. But by mid-1943, after months of furious testing and field modifications, the bugs were being systematically eliminated. Submarine commanders who'd spent the first year of the war cursing faulty torpedoes were finally getting weapons that actually worked. The Mark 18 electric torpedo, introduced in late 1943, added another dimension to American submarine capability. Unlike the Mark 14's steam propulsion, which left a visible wake, the Mark 18 ran wakeless, powered by batteries and electric motors. It was slower, only 29 knots compared to 46, and had shorter range, but for close-range attacks where stealth mattered more than speed, it was devastating. Japanese lookouts couldn't see them coming, which meant convoys had no warning before torpedoes started hitting. USS Tang, under Richard O'Kane, would demonstrate the full potential of Gato-class torpedo capacity during her 4th patrol in October 1944. O'Kane had learned aggressive tactics from Mush Morton and refined them into a systematic method for destroying entire convoys. His approach was surgical brutality. Close to point-blank range, fire full spreads at multiple targets simultaneously, reload and fire again, continue attacking until either all torpedoes were expended or all targets were destroyed. On the night of October 23, 1944, Tang encountered a convoy of 9 ships north of Formosa. O'Kane fired 23 torpedoes in less than 90 minutes. He sank 6 ships and damaged 3 others, before a circular running torpedo from his final salvo struck Tang's stern, sinking his own boat. The fact that he'd fired 23 torpedoes in one engagement would have been unthinkable in 1941. By late 1944, it was standard doctrine for aggressive commanders. The spread attack required sophisticated fire control calculations that the torpedo data computer made possible. The TDC was an analog mechanical computer that continuously solved the geometric problem of where to aim torpedoes to hit moving targets. The operator input target bearing, range, angle on the bow, estimated speed, and the device calculated the proper gyro angle for each torpedo. For spread attacks, the TDC operator would calculate a base solution for the center of the target, then add or subtract degrees for each torpedo in the spread. A typical 6-torpedo spread might use gyro angles of -6, -3, 0, +3, +6, and +9 degrees, creating a fan pattern that covered approximately 300 yards of ocean. Any target within that zone would be hit by at least one torpedo, possibly several. The Japanese had nothing comparable to the TDC. Their submarines used manual calculation methods that required more time and provided less accuracy. Japanese torpedo officers used specialized slide rules and plotting boards to calculate firing solutions, a process that took minutes rather than the continuous real-time updates the TDC provided. This meant Japanese submarines couldn't adjust their attacks as quickly when targets maneuvered, and they couldn't fire effective spreads because calculating multiple solutions manually was too slow. The technological advantage compounded the doctrinal advantage, creating a situation where American submarines were simply operating at a different level of capability. Training was the third component of American submarine dominance. Before deploying to the Pacific, every submarine went through intensive training at the Submarine School in New London, Connecticut, followed by shakedown cruises, where crews drilled constantly on torpedo attacks. The forward torpedo room crew practiced reload drills until they could move 1.5 tons of high explosive from storage to tube in under 8 minutes while the boat maneuvered violently. Fire control parties drilled on the TDC until they could generate firing solutions within seconds of receiving target data. Captains ran simulated attacks against friendly destroyers, playing enemy convoy escorts, learning how to position for maximum effect and evade counterattacks. By 1943, American submarine crews were the most thoroughly trained submariners in any navy. The Japanese submarine service, by contrast, suffered from training deficiencies that grew worse as the war progressed. Early losses of experienced crews meant replacements had less mentoring and on-the-job training. Japanese submarine doctrine never evolved the way American doctrine did because the institutional knowledge to drive that evolution was being killed faster than it could be passed down. The learning curve that American submarines climbed between 1941 and 1943 was a curve the Japanese never managed to ascend. USS Flasher provides another case study in maximum aggression torpedo tactics. Under Commander Reuben Whittaker, Flasher departed Fremantle, Australia, in December 1943 for her third war patrol with orders to hunt in the South China Sea. On December 19th, Whittaker encountered a Japanese convoy of 4 tankers escorted by destroyers. These weren't ordinary tankers. They were large fleet oilers carrying refined petroleum from the Dutch East Indies to Japan, each one representing thousands of tons of fuel the Japanese Navy desperately needed. Whittaker positioned Flasher ahead of the convoy and waited at periscope depth. When the lead tanker was 2,000 yards away, he fired a 6-torpedo spread from the forward tubes. 4 torpedoes hit. The tanker exploded so violently that debris rained down on Flasher's periscope. Before the escorts could react, Whittaker swung the stern around and fired a 4-torpedo spread at the second tanker. 3 hits. The tanker broke in half and sank in less than 5 minutes. Flasher dove deep to evade the escorts, but Whittaker wasn't finished. He maneuvered underwater for 30 minutes, repositioning ahead of the remaining tankers, then surfaced and chased them down. By dawn, Flasher had expended 18 torpedoes and sunk all 4 tankers. Total tonnage destroyed, over 39,000 tons in a single engagement. The Japanese Navy's fuel situation, already critical, became catastrophic. Those 4 tankers represented approximately 4% of Japan's monthly oil imports. 1 submarine, 1 night, one example of what happened when Gato-class boats were fought the way they were designed to be fought. The reload capability became a tactical weapon in itself. Japanese convoy commanders learned to fear the pause after an initial attack more than the attack itself. A submarine that fired 6 torpedoes and then went silent might be diving to escape, or it might be reloading to fire another salvo. The uncertainty paralyzed Japanese tactical responses. Escorts didn't know whether to chase the submarine or protect the remaining ships in the convoy. Often they chose wrong, charging after a submarine that had already reloaded and was positioning for a second attack from a different angle. USS Silversides demonstrated this perfectly in May 1943 during her 5th patrol. Commander John Coy attacked a convoy north of New Guinea, fired a 6-torpedo spread that sank 2 cargo vessels, then went silent for 12 minutes while his crew reloaded. The Japanese escorts assumed Silversides had fled and began rescuing survivors from the sunken ships. Coy surfaced 3,000 yards away and fired another 6-torpedo spread, sinking the largest remaining cargo ship and damaging a destroyer. The escorts charged toward the new firing position, and Coy dove, reloaded again, and 20 minutes later surfaced on the opposite side of the convoy to fire his stern tubes at the remaining ships. 18 torpedoes fired in 45 minutes from 3 different positions. The Japanese reported being attacked by a wolf pack of at least 3 submarines. It was one Gato-class boat with a commander who understood that his 24 torpedoes were meant to be used, not hoarded. The Japanese response to American submarine tactics evolved slowly and incompletely. By mid-1943, Japanese naval intelligence understood that American submarines were firing multiple torpedoes per attack, but they never developed effective countermeasures. They increased convoy escorts, but more escorts couldn't stop torpedoes that were already in the water. They attempted zigzag patterns, but well-calculated spreads covered the most likely evasion routes. They tried routing convoys closer to shore, where shallow water limited submarine operations, but Gato-class boats had operating depths that allowed them to function in surprisingly shallow water, and American commanders were willing to take risks that Japanese planners didn't anticipate. The fundamental problem was that Japanese anti-submarine doctrine assumed submarines would attack cautiously and conservatively. American submarines attacked with industrial-scale violence, and there was no doctrine to counter that. The kill-per-patrol statistics tell the story of American submarine effectiveness increasing dramatically as tactics evolved. In 1942, the average American submarine patrol sank 1.3 Japanese ships. By 1943, that average had increased to 2.8 ships per patrol. By 1944, it reached 4.1 ships per patrol. The increase wasn't because submarines were getting better, though they were. It was because commanders were learning to use their 24 torpedo capacity aggressively, firing full spreads at multiple targets instead of conserving ammunition. The Gato-class design that had seemed like overkill in 1941 turned out to be exactly right for the way the Pacific submarine war needed to be fought. USS Barb under Eugene Fluckey took aggressive torpedo tactics to their logical extreme. Fluckey believed that if you had 24 torpedoes, you should fire all 24 if you had 24 viable targets. During Barb's 11th patrol in January 1945, Fluckey encountered a massive Japanese convoy in the South China Sea. 30 cargo ships, tankers, and transports escorted by multiple destroyers. Fluckey spent an hour positioning Barb for the perfect attack, then fired a 6-torpedo spread at the convoy's center. While those torpedoes were still running, he ordered the forward tubes reloaded and simultaneously fired his 4 stern torpedoes at different targets. Before the escorts could respond, Fluckey surfaced and chased the scattering convoy at flank speed, firing another 6 torpedoes from the forward tubes at fleeing ships. Over the next 2 hours, Barb fired all 24 torpedoes at targets throughout the convoy formation. Fluckey's patrol report claimed 10 ships sunk, later confirmed by Japanese records as 8 confirmed sinks and 2 probables. 1 submarine, 1 convoy. Devastation on a scale the Japanese had no way to prevent. The psychological impact on Japanese merchant crews was severe and measurable. By late 1944, Japanese merchant marine casualties had reached levels where recruiting new sailors became increasingly difficult. Men knew that boarding a cargo ship or tanker meant high probability of death by submarine attack. The Japanese merchant marine lost 62% of its tonnage during the war. Over 116,000 Japanese merchant sailors died, a higher casualty rate than any branch of the Japanese military. They died because American submarines carried enough torpedoes to destroy entire convoys, and American commanders were trained and equipped to do exactly that. The men crewing those cargo ships understood they were sailing in floating coffins. Japanese convoy routes became graveyards, and the men who survived attacks told stories of multiple torpedo impacts within minutes, of submarines that seemed to have unlimited weapons, of attacks that didn't stop until everything was sinking or burning. The industrial context made American torpedo expenditure sustainable in ways that Japanese planners never matched. By 1944, American shipyards were delivering new submarines faster than existing boats could be crewed. The submarine force had evolved from a pre-war service of fewer than 60 boats to a fleet of over 200 operating submarines. Each one carried 24 torpedoes. That meant the Pacific Submarine Force had a floating inventory of nearly 5,000 torpedoes at any given time, with production replacing expended ordnance continuously. The Japanese had nothing remotely comparable. Their submarine force peaked at around 60 operational boats, and torpedo production never exceeded American levels by even a fraction. The asymmetry meant American submarines could fight a war of attrition that the Japanese couldn't possibly win. USS Archerfish demonstrated the strategic impact of this torpedo capacity during her 5th patrol in November 1944. Commander Joseph Enright was patrolling east of Tokyo Bay when he encountered what lookouts initially identified as a large warship escorted by destroyers. Enright tracked the target for 6 hours, eventually identifying it as the aircraft carrier Shinano, the largest carrier ever built, displacing over 72,000 tons. Shinano was on her maiden voyage, sailing from Yokosuka to Kure for final fitting out. Enright positioned Archerfish ahead of Shinano's course and waited. At 2300 hours on November 29th, he fired a 6-torpedo spread from 1,500 yards. 4 torpedoes hit Shinano's starboard side. The carrier's watertight integrity was compromised due to incomplete construction, and flooding spread faster than damage control teams could contain it. Shinano sank 7 hours later, taking over 1,000 sailors with her. 1 submarine, 6 torpedoes, the largest warship ever sunk by submarine attack. The engagement was only possible because Archerfish carried enough torpedoes to fire a full spread with confidence that at least some would hit, and because Enright had been trained to press attacks aggressively rather than conservatively. The night surface attack, enabled by Gato-class speed and firepower, became the signature American submarine tactic by 1944. Submarines would track convoys during daylight while submerged, surface after dark, race ahead of the convoy at 17 to 20 knots, position themselves perpendicular to the convoy's course, and fire full spreads as the ships passed. The low silhouette of a surfaced submarine was nearly invisible at night, especially against dark water. By the time Japanese lookouts spotted the torpedo wakes, it was too late to maneuver, and by the time escorts charged toward the firing position, the submarine had already fired again from a different angle, or had crash-dived and was repositioning underwater. The tactic worked because Gato-class boats could do things simultaneously that other submarines had to do sequentially. Fire torpedoes while maneuvering at high speed, reload while evading, attack from multiple positions in a single engagement. The Japanese never developed effective counters because the tactics exploited capabilities that Japanese submarines simply didn't have. The end of the war in August 1945 left American submarines with thousands of unfired torpedoes still loaded in their tubes and magazines. Some boats returned to port with full or nearly full combat loads because targets had become so scarce in the final months. The Japanese merchant marine had been essentially destroyed. Over 85% of Japan's pre-war merchant tonnage was on the ocean floor, and American submarines were responsible for approximately 55% of those losses. The Gato-class submarine and the doctrine of aggressive torpedo expenditure had accomplished what strategic bombing and surface naval action alone couldn't. They'd strangled Japan's ability to import the resources necessary to continue fighting. Every cargo ship that sank meant less oil, less food, less raw material for Japanese industry. Every tanker destroyed meant fewer sorties for Japanese aircraft, less fuel for warships, reduced mobility for ground forces. The cumulative effect was economic collapse. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that American submarine warfare was possibly the single most effective campaign of the Pacific War in terms of strategic impact per resource invested. The submarine force never exceeded 2% of U.S. naval personnel, but accounted for 55% of Japanese shipping losses. The tonnage-to-cost ratio was extraordinary. Each Gato-class submarine, at approximately $2 million, sank an average of 5.3 Japanese ships during its service life, representing roughly $50 million in destroyed enemy assets and cargo. No other weapon system in any theatre achieved comparable return on investment. The 24 torpedo capacity that seemed excessive in peacetime design discussions turned out to be the critical factor that made this possible. The mechanics of executing a 24 torpedo patrol required logistical planning that began long before a submarine left port. At Pearl Harbor's submarine base, torpedo loading was a carefully choreographed operation that took an entire day. Each Mark 14 torpedo arrived on a specialized cart, rolled along rails to the submarine's side, then carefully hoisted aboard using cranes that could handle the 3,200-pound weapons without damaging the precision instruments inside. The forward torpedo room received its complement first. 6 torpedoes were loaded directly into tubes, then 4 more were positioned in storage racks beneath the deck plates, and another 4 were suspended in overhead racks. The compartment became a maze of high explosive, with barely enough room for the crew to move between the weapons. The after torpedo room followed the same procedure with its 4 tubes and 4 reloads. The entire process required signatures and verification at each step because a single damaged torpedo could malfunction catastrophically, and a malfunctioning torpedo in a submarine's confined spaces meant everyone died. The crews who handled these weapons developed an intimate understanding of their temperament and their flaws. The Mark 14 torpedo was a marvel of engineering and a monument to bureaucratic incompetence in equal measure. Its design dated back to the 1920s, when the Navy had decided to develop a torpedo using the German G7 design as inspiration. The result was a weapon that could theoretically travel 4,500 yards at 46 knots, controlled by a gyroscope that maintained course with a magnetic influence exploder that would detonate the warhead when passing beneath a ship's keel. In theory, this was revolutionary. The explosion beneath the keel would break the ship's back, snapping the hull in a way that a side impact couldn't match. In practice, the magnetic exploder was sensitive to Earth's magnetic field variations, which differed significantly between the testing grounds off Newport, Rhode Island, and the combat zones of the Pacific. Torpedoes would detonate prematurely, or not at all, or would run beneath targets without exploding. Submarine commanders in 1942 spent more time cursing the Bureau of Ordnance than they spent cursing the Japanese. Men like Mush Morton and Sam Dealey risked their boats and crews to position perfect shots, only to watch torpedoes malfunction in ways that defied logic. Some torpedoes ran 10 feet deeper than their depth settings. Others broached the surface and porpoised along, alerting targets to their approach. Contact exploders failed when torpedoes hit at perpendicular angles because the firing pin was too fragile and would shatter on impact rather than triggering detonation. The submarine force fought 2 wars simultaneously during 1942 and 43, one against the Japanese and another against their own torpedo establishment. The torpedo establishment initially refused to believe field reports of failures. They insisted the weapons worked perfectly in controlled tests and that combat failures must be due to operator error or cowardice. This institutional arrogance cost American lives and prolonged the war by months. The breaking point came in June. 1943, when Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, authorized unauthorized testing using live torpedoes against cliffs at Kahulawe Island in Hawaii. The tests proved definitively that the contact exploders were defective. Lockwood ordered immediate field modifications, and submarine tenders began deactivating the magnetic exploders and fixing the contact exploder firing pins. By August 1943, American submarines finally had torpedoes that worked reliably. The impact was immediate and catastrophic for Japanese shipping. Submarine commanders who'd been conserving torpedoes because half their weapons were malfunctioning suddenly had confidence that full spreads would actually detonate on target. The sinking rate doubled within months. USS Wahoo's fifth patrol in August 1943 illustrated what happened when reliable torpedoes met aggressive tactics. Mush Morton took Wahoo into the Sea of Japan through the heavily defended La Perouse Strait, a passage so dangerous that most submarine commanders avoided it entirely. Morton didn't avoid anything. He spent 2 weeks in the Sea of Japan, which the Japanese considered a protected inland sea, and proceeded to hunt convoys with methodical violence. On August 5th, Wahoo encountered a convoy of 4 cargo ships. Morton fired a 6-torpedo spread that sank 2 ships immediately. He reloaded and attacked the remaining ships 30 minutes later, sinking one and damaging the other. On August 7th, he found another convoy and repeated the process. 6 torpedoes, 3 ships sunk. By the time Wahoo exited the Sea of Japan on August 21st, she'd expended all 24 torpedoes and sank or damaged 9 Japanese ships. The patrol became legendary within the submarine force. Morton had demonstrated that a single submarine with working torpedoes and aggressive tactics could dominate an entire sea, even one the enemy considered secure. The training infrastructure that produced commanders like Morton was itself a weapon system. The submarine school at New London operated continuously throughout the war, cycling officers and enlisted men through progressively more complex training. Officers attended the Prospective Commanding Officers School, known as PCO School, where they learned attack doctrine, torpedo fire control, evasion techniques, and damage control procedures. The course emphasized aggressive tactics from the start. Instructors were combat veterans rotated back from the Pacific specifically to teach the next generation what actually worked versus what the pre-war manuals had recommended. Students spent hours in attack simulators, running approach scenarios against mock convoys, learning to calculate firing solutions using the TDC, practicing the timing and geometry of spread attacks. The simulators could replicate emergency situations, forcing students to make decisions under pressure when escorts were charging, and targets were maneuvering unpredictably. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.